Now let's go straight to Washington, D.C. to speak to the USA's former UN ambassador and President Donald Trump's National Security Advisor, John Bolton, for this very special edition of Going Underground. Ambassador, thanks so much for coming back on. So Joe Biden ended his State of the Union with the words "get him" in the style of previous officials against Osama bin Laden, perhaps. He's spending the weekend at Camp David. If you were still National Security Advisor, what would you be telling Joe Biden to do?
Well, I'd be saying that until the Russian energy sector is effectively collapsed, Putin has no incentive to give up his ongoing offensive in Ukraine. And honestly, with oil prices what they are, even if Russia has to sell at a discount, it's still making money off this war. There's every reason to think he'll continue until he achieves whatever his objectives in Ukraine are. You know, the failure here is not imposing sanctions on Putin. The failure is we failed to deter him. And the cost of that failure is now being borne by the Ukrainian people, and it will be borne by Russians. And by the way, it will be borne by Europeans and Americans too, as the price of oil goes up. So being content with a long, dragged-out process is not in our interest.
So what, from your point of view, this war is being financed in effect by Europeans buying Russian energy resources that supply 40% of the market?
Right. I mean, right now, as the war is progressing, oil and gas are still being transmitted through pipelines all across Europe, and Russia is being reimbursed for them, despite sanctions that take some Russian banks out of the SWIFT system. 2 of the 3 top Russian banks are still receiving payments because they're energy related. The United States is still importing oil from Russia, really pretty incredible. And in the meantime, the Russian military, which has had its problems in Ukraine, is grinding down opposition in Kyiv and Kharkiv. And the Ukrainians have defended themselves heroically, but the correlation of forces, as we used to say in Soviet days, very much against them, and time will not be on their side.
Yeah, I'll get to the war in a second. I mean, Russia says it's all going to plan, of course, as you'd expect. But as regards the energy resources, what did you make of Sergei Lavrov saying Americans are dictating to the Germans what is good for European energy security, and they're trying to impose their own view of the future of Europe? Napoleon and Hitler, they had the objective to have the whole of Europe under their control. Now Americans have got Europe under control. Do you think they're listening to what Lavrov is saying, which is why they're not listening to you?
I doubt it, because I don't think Americans really care about having Europe under control. Frankly, I think what we're telling Germany and others in Europe now is exactly what Ronald Reagan told Margaret Thatcher and other European leaders in the 1980s. Do not become totally dependent on Russian oil and gas. And from all we can tell, the new German chancellor has just agreed with that. But it takes time to shift, to build offloading facilities for liquefied natural gas, to construct new pipelines. It should be common sense to the Europeans that you want multiple potential suppliers for your energy resources. And I think they've now learned that lesson.
You just said Americans don't care whether they control Europe. Obviously, the U.S. has clearly cared about influencing Europe for decades, and obviously will have a measure of control if liquefied natural gas comes from the United States to roll on, roll off port structures that are rapidly being created in Europe.
Well, what we're concerned about in Europe is the security and safety of the United States. And since 1945, we believe that a secure Europe is in America's best interest. But frankly, what goes on in Europe beyond that is really not something that most Americans care about, because they don't really care about these kinds of things in other parts of the world. We would like to be safe and secure, and that means making sure the Europeans don't lapse into yet another world war like the first 2 hot wars and much of the Cold War fought in Europe as well.
Yeah, but I mean, it's the United States that's been funding Ukraine since 2014, since the coup. I mean, you can see that there are 2 sides being given on this story. One side is Russia is trying to end the brutal putsch regime from 2014 financed by the United States in the heart of Europe, so it can no longer kill people there, 14,000 dead.
Well, that's the Hall of Mirrors view of what happened in Ukraine in 2014, and unfortunately, it's the Ukrainian people who are paying for that misperception.
So what is the price that Biden name-checked at the State of the Union. He said Putin must pay a price. What is that price that, maybe Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken want to charge Putin?
Well, I don't think they know. I mean, if you are concerned about the war that's being conducted in Ukraine now, you should have been more concerned about it before it started. Because every day that goes by, the cost of the war goes up. And I think what Putin is counting on, and he may be right, is whenever this ends, and almost however it ends, he's counting on European memories to be short and for these sanctions to disappear. And I have to say, based on the history we've seen, I'm not counting on European resolve to keep these sanctions in place. That's the play that Putin has made. And as he said to me on several occasions, you have your logic, we have our logic, we'll see which one prevails.
Wait, so, I've got to defend Biden, I suppose, and his team there, and say they were warning, and U.S. intelligence, which has gained such a lack of respect, obviously, since Iraq, they did successfully warn, didn't they, this time round?
But they failed. You know, deterrence is not intended to equate the failure of deterrence with the punishment that comes later. Success in constructing structures of deterrence is to make sure the war doesn't happen, and those failed. So obviously, all of the messages being sent to Putin were not sufficient.
And back to what you were just saying about sanctions, you do expect sanctions to lapse very swiftly, after a completion of military operations as seen from Moscow and mission accomplished statement from Putin in the Kremlin?
Look, my prediction, I've been making it for months, I might as well keep making it now. It can't get any better or any worse, is I don't think Putin wants all of Ukraine under Russian control. I think he wants the eastern and southern parts of the country. He wants control of the north coast of the Black Sea. And I think if he had his druthers, he'd set up a Vichy France kind of government in the rest of Ukraine. He may not be able to get that, but if he only controls the eastern and southern parts of the country, I think a lot of Europeans and honestly a lot of Americans would say, is that all? Gee, it could have been a lot worse. Let's go back to business as usual.
Well, because in part, you may not like it, but in part, obviously, there's this fear of nuclear war, which has kept on cropping up even on major news bulletins.
The only fear of nuclear war here is because Putin said he was changing the alert status of Russian nuclear forces. I think whenever somebody does that, you have to take it seriously, but you also have to try and analyze it objectively. I think it's a bluff intended to intimidate some Westerners, and he has succeeded in part. But I don't think it's a serious threat. The Secretary General of NATO basically said the same thing.
Wasn't it when President Zelensky said he was going to have to reevaluate the nuclear arms positioning because the creation of Ukraine and the destruction of the nuclear weapons or the withdrawing of their nuclear weapons was predicated on Ukraine being a whole state?
Well, I think there's a little bit of misinformation in history here. Those were always Soviet nuclear weapons. They were never under Kyiv's command and control. But I think what he is reflecting properly is the great powers gave Ukraine assurance of the territorial integrity of the state, which has obviously been breached by one of the signatory parties to the treaty, namely Russia.
Can you understand why in most of the world, despite the international community clearly being with the USA and its co-signee Albania at the UN General Assembly, most of the world could be forgiven for thinking that the fear of nuclear weapons means that, in effect, NATO is using Ukraine against Russia while refusing to fight against Russia in the actual theater of war, pouring in weapons to a country which does not have the military capacity to defeat Russia. I don't know for what particular reason, because obviously it's going to prolong the war and prolong the number of casualty reports daily.
Well, had it been done properly by the Biden administration, which it wasn't, the supply of weapons, adequate training in the weapons, and use of the weapons would have been intended to raise the human cost to the Russian government for any invasion, and that should cause deterrence. But I don't think enough weapons were shipped in. I don't think we put enough U.S. and NATO trainers in. You know, we had special operations forces in Ukraine working with the Ukrainian military right up until a few weeks ago, and our people didn't want to leave because they could see what was going to happen. They could see this Russian buildup on the border, and they wanted to stay and help the Ukrainians. And it's a I think for Biden, he faces real risk here that he will be seen as having done too little too late if Russian forces continue to bomb Ukrainian cities and grind down its population.
Well, we can't verify any reports, obviously, about what CIA in Ukraine said just before the invasion. But that again goes back to the point that the pouring in of weapons right now, once the invasion started, is prolonging the war and will kill more Ukrainians and Russians before the ultimate victory of Russia.
People believe in fighting for their independence are obviously willing to do what it takes to achieve it. And it's not like there's a threat of Ukraine invading Russia. I think it's pretty clear to everybody what's going on here.
Why do you think it was so important for Washington, even before the invasion, to do that training and risk World War III, as it now apparently appears as a commonplace in NATO nation media, even though there was no way that Ukraine could join NATO because under the Minsk agreement ratified by Washington and London at the Security Council, said that the disputed areas of Luhansk and Donetsk must be recognized, which would mean disputed areas, which would mean Ukraine can't even join NATO.
Well, that's a crisis that Russia's created by illegally crossing international boundaries and annexing the Crimea, which the United States doesn't recognize, as it never recognized the incorporation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the Soviet Union. NATO is a defensive alliance. Everybody understands that. I think clearly what Putin is doing, he announced in his speech to the State Duma in 2005 when he said the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. That was Putin's view. In Ukraine, they were quite happy that the Soviet Union broke up, and they're not looking to get the gang back together again. That's what this war is about. It's a war of imperial conquest by a czarist president in Moscow.
I don't think anyone recognizes NATO as a defensive alliance, arguably. I know that's a talking point repeated in NATO nations, but...
history will bear me out on that.
Ambassador, I'll stop you there. More from the 27th National Security Advisor of the United States after this break. Welcome back. I'm still here with the former U.S. Ambassador to the UN and the 27th U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton. When you mention imperial power, then is it the case, and we've talked to Russians here and challenged them, who've been so critical of U.S. foreign policy in Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, isn't it a case that Russia's just doing what the United States did, supported by you? And there are parallels here of U.S. interference in countries since 9/11.
Well, great. Let's take it one by one, but let's start a little earlier than 9/11. The U.S. has invaded Iraq twice, the first time because Iraq invaded Kuwait. And in order to restore sovereignty to Kuwait, we went into Iraq and basically destroyed its army. Now, in retrospect, we probably should have done more, but that's the kind of situation in which the U.S. has historically fought. Not because we want territory for ourselves, not because we seek economic advantage, but because one of our friends or allies has been invaded by somebody else. That's what's happening in Ukraine today. And the difference between Russian actions and U.S. just about as clear as it could be. Your line of argument is like the old saying that here you've got an old lady in the near the path of a bus that's out of control. One man comes up to her and pushes her in the front of the bus, and another man comes up to her and pushes her away from the bus. And somebody says, well, both these people are just pushing old ladies around.
Not sure I quite get the parallel of that one. Okay, but that does that mean that you would have supported this kind of military action or Stinger missiles and so on being sent after the referendum that obviously was not accepted by NATO nations in Crimea, recognizing that Crimea was part of Russia?
Look, what we wanted to do in Crimea was work with the government of Ukraine, which was not in a position to engage in any military activity in Crimea after it was annexed, but through diplomatic measures to get the Russians to reverse this, something that we said in 1945 was never going to happen in Europe again, which is international borders being changed by military force. And yet that's exactly what Russia did. It did it in Ukraine. It did it in Crimea, rather. It did it in Donbass. And it's doing it again now.
I mean, there are too many cases, Grenada, there's so many cases of arguable invasion. As you say,
we were invited in by the Association of Caribbean States because of a Cuba and Russian-supported coup in Grenada.
Which, of course, is what the other... I mean, there's so many parallels here, and these are the ones being argued across the global south. What about this phrase of peacekeepers? Can you understand? I mean, obviously, the UN Secretary General says this is a violation of international law, something that has been raised with previous Russian actions. Can you see how Moscow would see it as, wait a minute, we sent peacekeepers to broker peace in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We ended the war in Syria. We sought a ceasefire in Georgia and sorted all that out and quietened down the Georgian war. Wherever we go, all we do is bring peace.
Yeah, it looks pretty ugly when it happens, though. That involved fragmenting Georgia and splitting off two provinces to pretend they were independent countries. It means a Russian troop presence in Georgia and as well as in Azerbaijan and Armenia that freeze the conflicts there, just like there are Russian troops still in Moldova and the so-called Transnistria Republic, which I'd love to see someday. It must be about 10 feet wide at its widest. But it's this comical way of keeping Russian troops in Moldova and throughout Central Asia. I mean, I think the objectives here are pretty self-evident, and we're seeing the most violent expression of it in Ukraine today. But I think Putin's policy to recreate Russian hegemony at a minimum in the space of the former Soviet Union and maybe Russian sovereignty is completely open.
So what? Do you think the only reason there haven't been demonstrations in Transnistria or in Crimea have been the power of the Russian proxy authorities? Or do you actually think that those people in Crimea and Transnistria and other places, Abkhazia, they want to not be connected to Moscow?
I think they can see
there haven't been any demonstrations or anything.
Certainly. Well, maybe they don't want to get shot. That's always one possibility. The substance of Russian power in Crimea is undeniable, and I think that's part of the strategy that Putin has very successfully pursued. I think one of his dilemmas today is the vaunted Russian military is being humiliated.
Well, we're only getting one side of this. We're only getting one side of that story because obviously Russian media outlets have been banned in NATO countries.
I think we can see from above what's going on.
How soon do you expect China now to move on Taiwan, as you so long predicted? I've got a statement here from China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Hua Chunying. Taiwan is indeed not Ukraine. Taiwan has always been an inseparable part of China's territory. This is an irrefutable historical and legal fact.
Well, it seems to me that's a pretty clear statement. They're getting ready. And I think they're watching the U.S. and NATO's response in Ukraine very carefully. And if it continues to prove as ineffective, tragically, as it has been so far, I think China will draw the appropriate conclusions.
Or do you think the U.S. can pare China away from Russia? You must have noticed that some of the countries receiving lots of infrastructural investment from China, Venezuela, Cuba, they abstained on the UN General Assembly. I know the UN General Assembly thing was quite theatrical. The US has never respected UN General Assembly resolutions in the past. But what did you make of some peculiar abstentions from countries you'd think would vote with Moscow?
Well, I think that what it shows is that in this entente between Russia and China, that Russia is very much the junior partner. This is the exact reverse of Cold War days. And it's something I think Russia's leadership hasn't considered adequately. I've tried to explain that growing closer to China, growing further away from Europe and the United States, inevitably means subjugation for Russia at some level at some point. It's certainly not too late to reverse course now, but unless you want to be a part of Greater China by the end of this century, I think Russia needs to take another look at this.
Why couldn't they bring the United States closer to China, which would surely help the American people?
Because I think China's made it pretty clear they have hegemonic ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. It's why they have managed to give life to the Asian Quad, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. It's why the countries of the Indo-Pacific very much want to see more evidence of a strong American presence in the region. It's why the Australians have asked for nuclear-powered submarines, and we've now created a mechanism along with the United Kingdom to do this. I think people in Asia and the Indo-Pacific generally are waking up to China's aspirations, and they're going to take steps to prevent it from happening.
But what about the American people? Why is this a consistent theme that it must be about the Indo-Pacific? You know 40 million can't eat tonight in your country without food stamps. Why can't an alliance between Washington and Beijing be created out of the mess that is happening right now in the EU?
Because we're a free people and like being that way.
But surely it would benefit the people of the United States if business ties, economic ties can be made with Beijing.
We've got too many business and economic ties with Beijing now. Look, this is something they have gotten rich in China over the decades by stealing our intellectual property. People are beginning to wake up to that. I think it's this is something that's been growing over time, and I think we're going to see growing resistance to China's aspirations, not just in the United States, really, but around the world. But it's why the strategic significance of Ukraine is so high. Because if the West can't defend a country in the heart of Europe, our allies around the world are going to wonder what our staying power is. A lot is at stake for us here.
So capitalism and the free flow of trade, let alone media, but free trade, capitalism, that takes second place to these geostrategic concerns. The big businesses, I mean, obviously arms companies.
It does in China. There's not free trade and capitalism in China. It's a classic example of a command and control economy.
I mean, American capitalism and businesses in the United States wanting to trade with Chinese businesses for the mutual prosperity.
And I think more and more of them are realizing that dependence on supply chains that have a heavy Chinese component in them are very dangerous, unreliable, and they're looking for other places in Southeast Asia, in the Western Hemisphere, reshoring, as it's called, to the United States itself. All of this is happening, and I think at an increasingly rapid pace.
Well, clearly it's been historically a poor record, but you're implicitly kind of complimenting Donald Trump there, because presumably you understand that he understood that better than most. What do you think? Do you think anything would have been different if Trump had been in power? Would he have convened a summit in Geneva with Putin to sort things out?
No, I think the Russians would have gotten control of Kiev about a year ago.
Why?
Because I think Trump barely knew where Ukraine was on a map, frankly, and his biggest concern with Ukraine was finding that missing computer server for Hillary Clinton and determining what Hunter Biden's finances in Ukraine were. And I think it had a negative effect on U.S.-Ukrainian relations that formed a part of the difficulty Ukraine had in trying to establish a relationship with the United States for over a year and a half.
Well, those Hunter Biden claims are still making a lot of headway in the U.S. media, as you know. That's probably...
I can't wait to find out what the truth is on Hunter Biden's riches. I just can't wait.
Well, clearly that's how ordinary Americans even know maybe about Ukraine. Iran, of course, is supporting Moscow, one of the global energy superpowers. Do you expect them now to get nuclear weapons?
Well, I expect the Biden administration, which has been making one concession after another to Iran, to do anything necessary to get back into the 2015 nuclear deal. The best I can see from an observer's position is they're going to try and get back in perhaps in the next couple of weeks. I think that would be a mistake. I think the 2015 deal was flawed from the beginning. It hasn't gotten any better with age, but the Biden administration is determined to get in. I think now because they want to get more oil pumped into international markets to lower gasoline prices for fear of what's going to happen to them in the 2022 congressional elections.
And on the sanctions, finally, do you expect them to finish quickly, or do you think that actually the Ukraine conflict spells the end of the dollar as an international currency because of the swiftness and I use that word swift, obviously, arguably emphatically, is it the end of the dollar-based system as huge numbers of countries now sanctioned by the United States get closer and closer together to different ways of transferring money? Obviously, there are big cryptocurrency exchanges now on Wall Street and other methods which are not regulated by the Federal Reserve.
No, I think actually the dollar is proving how important it is, how important it continues to be, and I don't see any huge demand to trade in Chinese yuan or Russian rubles. And as far as cryptocurrency goes, look, if you want to buy black tulip bulbs, be my guest.
And Putin, do you think he will have to go for NATO nation countries and European Union leaders to accept any rapprochement as this crisis, like all other crises, slowly fades?
I think Putin expects Western resolve, particularly European resolve, to fail sooner rather than later and to restore something approaching normality in economic relations. And ultimately not pay nearly the price that people today in the West are speaking of. That I think is his expectation.
Do you think Blinken and Sullivan will accept any kind of rapprochement?
Sure they will.
Ambassador Bolton, thank you.
Thanks for having me.